Good morning to everyone. It's already been said, we're appreciative of everyone's presence, especially those who have been traveling and have made it back safely, and want to continue to remember those who are still on roads of travel. This morning we want to study a character from the Old Testament book of Judges. As a whole, Judges is a fascinating read. As one commentator put it, in terms of sheer spectacle, no tabloid of today could offer you more. It has scenes of gruesome murder, lustful exploits, superhuman feats of strength. Judges also includes the stories of some of the Bible's most well-known heroes, such as Gideon and Samson. But it also outlines one of the darkest periods in the history of God's people. Brother Nate gave an overview of the book of Judges early last year. I stole this slide from him. But as you can see, the overlying theme of the book is the repeated failure of the children of Israel to remain faithful to God, particularly after the death of Joshua. Over and over, they would do evil in the sight of the Lord, and they would serve false gods, and God would strengthen some king against them who would defeat them and oppress them for years. And then the people would eventually repent and cry out to the Lord, and He would raise up for them a warrior who was known as a judge, and that's where the book gets its title from. But that judge would save them from their enemies. These judges, by the way, were far from perfect themselves, but they were used by God to deliver His people. And Israel would enjoy peace for a while, but when that judge died, they would return to their sinful ways. And this went on for generation after generation. Just a vicious cycle of salvation, but then sin and slavery. In chapter 10, we have a perfect illustration of this cycle. Because of their unfaithfulness, God turned Israel over to the Philistines and the Ammonites, who afflicted and oppressed them for 18 years. And Israel cried out to the Lord, admitting their sins. But beginning in verse 11, here was God's response. He said, "Didn't I save you from the hands of many other nations?" And he names several examples. "Yet you abandoned me and served other gods. So I will no longer save you. Go, cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them save you." Verse 16 says, "So they removed the foreign gods from among them and served the Lord, and He could no longer endure the misery of Israel." Well, it's in this setting that we are introduced to a man by the name of Jephthah, who would become one of God's judges. And by the way, in Hebrews, the 11th chapter, in what we commonly call the Faith Hall of Fame, right among the names of famous heroes such as Gideon and Samson and David and Samuel, we find mentioned there in verse 32 this rather obscure name, Jephthah. And so apparently he's someone that the New Testament writer thought was worthy for us to consider. At the beginning of Judges chapter 11, we're told that he was a Gileadite, and he was also the son of Gilead. That's a little confusing because the name Gilead appears several times throughout the Bible, but this is going to become an important part to our story. And so bear with me as I try to explain here. You remember that Joseph, of course, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, Joseph had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And because Joseph received a double portion of the inheritance from his father, then when it came time to assign the tribes of Israel, instead of a tribe of Joseph, each of his two sons became a tribe. And so we have the tribes of Manasseh and the tribe of Ephraim. Now, Manasseh had a son named Machir, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who had a son named Gilead. And it's from him that came the group of Israelites known as the Gileadites, according to Numbers 26 and verse 29. And so the Gileadites were descendants of Manasseh. But in addition to that, there was also an area of land, a mountainous area of land to the east of the Jordan River, which was also known as Gilead. In fact, the name Gilead means rocky region or hill country. And as you would assume, inhabitants of this region were sometimes known as Gileadites. Now, whether these were the same Gileadites as the family of Manasseh that we just talked about is kind of difficult to pinpoint. Seems that perhaps this was called Gilead before that Gilead was known. But according to Joshua 13, at least part of the land of Gilead was in fact given to the tribe of Manasseh, who again had a grandson named Gilead. And so when Judges 11 says that Jephthah was a Gileadite, that could refer to his family heritage being a descendant of Manasseh, or it could refer to his homeland being from the land of Gilead, or quite likely it could refer to both. And to confuse matters even more, Judges 11 verse 1 also says that Jephthah's father was named, you guessed it, Gilead. And that seems to just be a coincidence, but it's a confusing one to say the least. Well, back to our story, Judges 11. In Judges 11, we are introduced to Jephthah. And we're told that his father had a wife who bore him children, but his father's wife was not the mother of Jephthah. Jephthah's mother was actually a prostitute. And obviously this caused some friction among the family members. And when Jephthah's half-brothers grew up, they ran Jephthah away from home, saying, "You shall not have an inheritance in our father's house, for you are the son of another woman." And so Jephthah settled in the land of Tob, and he became the leader of a gang of what the Bible calls vain or worthless men. It says that they went out with him, and many translations and commentators say that this means that they went out on raids, that they were fighting and stealing, a posse of bandits, we might say. But other commentators compare them to the group of men you might remember who followed David. These were various characters who society had rejected, and instead of plundering and pillaging and stealing villages themselves, David's group became a group of vigilantes, if you will. They protected settlements from thieves such as this. And so perhaps that too is what the group of friends, if you will, that group of men that Jephthah hung out with did. Either way, Jephthah must have gained a reputation as a pretty tough guy. Because after a while, we find that the sons of Ammon, the Ammonites, fought against Israel. And the elders of Gilead sent for Jephthah, and they asked him to come back home and to be their leader to help fight against the Ammonites. Well, as you can imagine, Jephthah was reluctant at first. His brothers, in fact, his people had run him off. They hadn't wanted anything to do with him. But now, because he had a reputation as a fighter, supposedly, they wanted him to come help them defend against the enemy. Well, Jephthah finally agrees, but only on the condition that if he were to fight for them, and if the Lord were to give him victory over the Ammonites, by the way, I think that's our first sign of the faith of Jephthah. If the Lord were to give him victory over the Ammonites, then the Gileadites would have to make him their leader. And so they agreed. And so Jephthah takes charge, and his first step, and it's one that I think is quite admirable, his first step was to reach out to the Ammonite king to try to negotiate a peaceful end to this conflict. He asks why they have declared war on Israel. And the king of Ammon makes it very clear that the reason that they were attacking Israel was because they felt that Israel had wrongfully taken land from his people, and that nothing short of giving up these disputed lands would stop the war. In verses 14 through 27, Jephthah responds with a masterful defense of Israel's right to these territories. He lays out 4 points in this defense, and it's one that would be worthy of any dream team lawyer. We won't take the time this morning to notice the details of his arguments. Perhaps we'll revisit that in a later study. But he ends his argument with these words. He says, "So I have not sinned against you, but you are doing me wrong by making war against me. May the Lord, the judge today between the sons of Israel and the sons of Ammon." Well, despite his brilliant defense, the Ammonites disregarded his message. And so Jephthah's attempt at diplomacy failed, and war was imminent. Verse 29 there of Judges 11 includes a couple of important details. It reads, "Now the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh. Then he passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead he went on to the sons of Ammon." First, the fact that Jephthah was led by God's Spirit. Of course, that made all the difference. That ensured his victory. But secondly, we're not told the exact purpose of what seems to be a journey through the land here. As we'll see later, though, I think it seems reasonable that he was trying to enlist as many Israelites as possible to assist in the battle ahead. And verses 32 and 33 tell us that God did, in fact, hand the Ammonites over to him. The Bible says that he inflicted a very great defeat. And so the sons of Ammon were subdued before the sons of Israel. Now, if you're familiar at all with the story of Jephthah, or maybe if you have your Bibles open and you're just now perusing the surrounding verses here at the end of Judges 11, you may know that within this story of great victory, there is a story that seems, at least at first reading, to be a terrible tragedy. Just before Jephthah crossed over to fight against the Ammonites, back in verses 30 and 31, he made what sounds like, especially in hindsight, sounds like a very rash, perhaps a very foolish vow to God. He said, "If you will indeed hand over to me the sons of Ammon," notice again, he's giving God the credit, but he says, "If you will hand over to me the sons of Ammon, then whatever comes out the doors of my house to meet me when I return safely from the sons of Ammon, it shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering." Well, as we've noted, God answered his prayer. But when Jephthah returned home in verse 34, to his shock, the first thing to meet him was his daughter, his one and only child. The Bible says that when he saw her, he tore his clothes, which at that point was a sign of great grief, and he cried, "Oh, my daughter, you have brought me disaster, and you are among those who trouble me. For I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot take it back." And despite the heartbreak that it must have brought him, Jephthah did fulfill his vow to God. I have to admit, that has always been one of the most disturbing scenes in all of the Bible to me. In fact, it might even make us question, how could God even accept and allow such a thing to happen? Well, the fact is, there are many instances in the Bible where a foolish decision resulted in a tragic or a terrible tragedy. And we must also accept that while God loves us and he does so much to protect us, he also often allows our foolish choices to bring about their natural consequences, not only to teach us, but so that others may also learn from our example. But in this case, I do want to offer an alternative interpretation that, to me at least, sheds a glimmer of hope on this tragic scene. I think it's safe to say that Jephthah never had his daughter, in fact, he never had any other person for that matter in mind when he made his vow. Notice again that he says, "Whatever comes out to meet me, it shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up as an offering." I don't think he ever imagined it would be his daughter. But more importantly, some commentators, such as James Kaufman, they contend that Jephthah, while he did fulfill his vow, he did not do so by sacrificing his daughter as a burnt offering, but instead by dedicating her to the service of God in the tabernacle. And Kaufman and others offer some quite convincing arguments along these lines. First of all, they point out that in the law of Moses, the firstborn of every womb, both man and beast, so that includes a person's firstborn child, they were to be offered to God. But that did not always mean by burnt sacrifice, especially not in the case of children. Children, and even some livestock, donkeys, for example, they could be redeemed by offering a lamb instead, according to Exodus chapter 13. Now, I'm not saying that Jephthah just simply sacrificed a lamb instead of his daughter. I don't think that seems to fit the story, the account, or the context at all. But what I'm saying is, it doesn't appear that God ever wanted parents to kill their innocent children. In fact, he despised that practice by the idolatrous and the heathen nations surrounding Israel. Now, someone might point out that Jephthah had specifically vowed a burnt offering. But Kaufman contends that the Hebrew word for burnt offering is really more focused on the idea of offering completely to God, not necessarily by death or by fire. It can also describe a young person being offered to serve God forever. In that sense, it's very reminiscent of Hannah. You remember Hannah so desperately wanted a child, and she said of her unborn child, "I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life." 1 Samuel 1 and verse 11. And when Samuel was born, Hannah offered her son Samuel to serve in the temple under Eli the high priest. But I think perhaps the most convincing argument that maybe Jephthah did not burn his daughter as a sacrifice revolves around her reaction. When her father told her about this vow, she says in verse 36 there, "Father, you've given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you have said." By the way, that is an inspiring attitude for such a young person, isn't it? But then in verse 37, she has one request. She says, "Allow me 2 months so that I may go to the mountains and weep because of my virginity, I and my friends." She didn't say, "Let me weep because of my untimely death," which is what you would expect from someone anticipating being offered as a burnt sacrifice. She said, "Let me weep because of my virginity." And verse 38 reiterates, it says, "So he let her go for 2 months, and she left with her friends and wept on the mountains because of her virginity." Now, I've heard people explain that this means she was sad because she was going to die having never been married. Honestly, though, that doesn't sound quite right to me. I would think that if a young girl was about to die, a man would be the least of her worries. What makes more sense to me is that being dedicated as a lifelong tabernacle servant would require her to remain unmarried. And so her dreams that surely she held, as every young girl did at that time, her dreams of having a family, remember how important family and children were, especially in those days, her dreams of having a family would never be fulfilled. And while we can certainly understand why Jephthah would have been very distraught over the thought of having to kill his daughter, we can also see how he would likewise be very upset over the impossibility of ever having grandchildren to carry on his lineage. Remember, this was his one and only child, and so by offering her as a virgin to service at the temple, he would not be able to have descendants. Notice also verse 39. It says there, "And at the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, who did to her what he had vowed, and she had no relations with a man." What did he do? He did what he had vowed. And it makes sense to me that what follows there in that sentence is that she would have no relations with a man, that she would dedicate her life as a perpetual virgin servant of the tabernacle. Furthermore, verse 36, or rather verse 40, says that the daughters of Israel went yearly to celebrate Jephthah's daughter. It makes sense that where they went would be to the tabernacle, where she was. Otherwise, if they were mourning her death, why would they need to go anywhere? Well, as I said, to consider that this is at least a possible explanation makes me feel a little bit better about the situation. But either way, whether he did in fact have to offer her as a burnt sacrifice or whether he offered her as a temple servant. I think the moral of the story is that we must be very careful what we vow, and that we must always, always stay true to our vows. Notice again Jephthah's steadfastness in verse 35. He said, I have given my word to the Lord, and I cannot take it back. What a statement that is. It's one that we should all make and that we should all stand by. I believe that's at least one of the reasons why Jephthah is listed as a hero of faith, and why almost 2,500 years later he serves as an example to us as New Testament Christians. When we obey the gospel, we make a vow, we make a pledge of faith and loyalty to God, and we dare not forsake that vow. Well, we're not finished with Jephthah just yet. In Judges, the 12th chapter, following the defeat of the Ammonites, we find men from the tribe of Ephraim are called to arms, and they confront Jephthah. And they say, why did you cross over to fight against the sons of Ammon without calling us to go with you? We will burn your house down on you. How's that for a greeting? Now, before we go further, I want us to remember who the tribe of Ephraim was. Ephraim, remember, was one of the sons of Joseph, a brother to Manasseh, whose grandson was Gilead. In other words, while all Israelites were related through the lineage of Jacob, these two tribes were both from the lineage of Joseph. They were quite literally brethren. But apparently there was some sibling rivalry, as we might call it, some jealousy. There's also evidence that the Ephraimites were quite arrogant. They considered themselves the most powerful of the tribes of Israel. Joshua had been from their tribe. The cities of Bethel and Shiloh, which were the earliest locations of the tabernacle, those cities were in their territory, and so maybe they saw themselves as the religious capital of Israel, so to speak. In short, they saw themselves as better than the Gileadites. They were full of pride. And as Proverbs 16 and 18 warns, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Notice their prideful attitude here. They were offended. Why? Simply because they were not asked to help. Now, this wasn't the first time that they had shown this attitude. Back in Judges, the 8th chapter, we see them making an almost identical complaint against Gideon following his victory over Midian. Verse 1 there of Judges 8 says, Then the men of Ephraim said to Gideon, What is this thing that you have done to us, not calling upon us when you went to fight against Midian? And they quarreled with him vehemently. Well, in that case, Gideon was able to kind of calm them down. He offered a little bit of flattery. He stroked their ego a bit. Clearly, they had not learned their lesson. And unfortunately for them, Jephthah was not in the mood for flattery and smooth talking. After all, he had just suffered the heartache of either losing his daughter or losing the chance of any descendants. But he did, however, try to reason with them, just as he had tried to reason with the king of Ammon. He says, beginning of verse 2 there of Judges 12, I and my people were in a major dispute with the sons of Ammon. And I did call you, but you did not save me from their hand. When I saw that you were no deliverer, I like that. I took my life in my hands and crossed over against the sons of Ammon, and the Lord handed them over to me. Again, compare their pride to his humility here. Why then have you come up to me this day to fight against me? Now, some critics have pointed to this claim here by Jephthah as a lie. They say that there's no evidence to show that Jephthah ever asked anyone for help. And my first response to that would be, who are we going to trust here? The Ephraimites, who had already proven their pride and their pettiness, or Jephthah, who gave God the credit, who had the Spirit of God, as we noticed in Judges 11:29. And also, if you recall, we noticed in that same verse that before engaging in war, Jephthah, it seems, traveled throughout the land, So it seems reasonable to me that that's when he asked Ephraim to help in his efforts, but yet they ignored his request. It also seems, though, that the men of Ephraim were just looking for a fight this time. After all, they started their conversation by threatening to burn down his house with him in it. And after Jephthah answers their complaint, they throw fuel on the fire by insulting him and his people. In verse 4, we're told that they chided, "You are survivors of Ephraim, you Gileadites, in the midst of Ephraim and in the midst of Manasseh." Now, that may not make much sense to us, that translation, but other translations use words like refugees, renegades, fugitives, deserters, even outcasts, rejects. One translation even uses the phrase half-breeds. Again, very insulting. And it was this attitude of elitism and bigotry that likely kept them from helping Jephthah in the first place. Clearly, the Ephraimites thought they were better, as we've said, than the Gileadites, and they needed to be taught a lesson in humility and respect. And I believe that God intended just that. Verse 4 says, "Then Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and fought Ephraim, and the men of Gilead defeated Ephraim." In fact, it was a crushing defeat. Verse 6 says that 42,000 from Ephraim fell. Now, once again, some have pointed to this and complained, if you will, or frowned upon Jephthah's actions. They say that this is nothing more than evil warmongering, that it was civil war, no less, that he was killing God's own people. But I believe that Jephthah still had the Spirit of God, and I believe he was following God's will. As we said, as I said, I think God was ready to teach Ephraim a lesson. Some commentators have pointed out that Ephraim perhaps was largely responsible in leading Israel into idolatry, that they were kind of the first to go down that road, and that had their arrogance not been thwarted at this point, then the split of the kingdom might have come a lot sooner than it eventually did. But regardless, their defeat is a clear warning against pride and prejudice and jealousy, especially among brethren. These are attitudes that today can destroy a church. If we see a brother or sister succeed, especially if that's a spiritual success, a victory for God, we should be happy for them. Certainly not jealous of any attention that they may receive, or grumble because we feel like we weren't included or it wasn't done the way that we wanted. Again, this is a warning against pride and jealousy. And speaking of lessons that we can learn, there's one more lesson that I want to notice, one more scene here in this story. Verses 5 and 6 tell us that as Jephthah and the Gileadites were defeating Ephraim, that they took control of the fords, which were simply more shallow crossing places of the Jordan River, in order to prevent any Ephraimites from escaping back to their homeland. And just in case any of them might pretend not to be from Ephraim, they devised a brilliant language test. Every man who was trying to cross the river would be asked, "Are you an Ephraimite?" And if he said no, then he would be told, "Then say Shibboleth." And many people believe that Shibboleth was simply the word for a river or flowing stream. That would make sense since they were crossing the Jordan River. But here was the catch. The people of Ephraim apparently could not make the SH, the sh sound. They pronounced it Sibboleth. Their speech betrayed them. And those who were found to be Ephraimites were captured and killed. I found it interesting that throughout history, similar war tactics have often been used to identify the true nationality of foreign spies. For example, American soldiers could identify German Nazi spies because the Germans had been taught English, but it was British English, which was different from American English. For example, Britons used the word lorry for what we call a truck. And still today, any custom, any phrase that's used to distinguish one group of people from another, especially it's one that identifies which side you're on, it's still called a shibboleth. If you look it up in the dictionary, you'll find that word. What's the lesson for us, though? Well, I think it's an important one. In fact, this was originally going to be the main idea of my study. My working title was, What's Your Shibboleth? And ultimately, I decided that all of Jephthah's story was worth considering, not just this scene. But for a moment, let's notice what we can learn from it. The lesson, I believe, is that sooner or later, our true identity will be revealed. And sometimes, like the Ephraimites, it's our speech that betrays us. If that phrase sounds familiar, your speech betraying you, that's what those who were standing around the fire during Jesus' trial said about Peter, that his speech betrayed him. And in his case, it was his Galilean accent that showed that he was one of Jesus' followers. I remember when I first moved here, even though I was from South Alabama, so I'm pretty country myself, but somebody asked me where I was living, and I said, Henryville. And the guy laughed and said, you ain't from around here, are you? Because anybody who's been here a while knows that it's Henryville. Well, God's not concerned about our accents and our pronunciations. But what he is concerned about is when our speech betrays our spiritual disloyalty. Jesus said, for out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, Matthew 12:34. And so, do the jokes that we tell, or the songs that we sing along with, or just our daily conversation, show an obsession with immorality? Is our speech filled with pronouns, I, me, my, mine, that shows a heart of selfish ambition? Is the majority of our speech occupied with topics such as work and money and recreation? Not that those things are wrong, but if that's all we talk about, does it show that, just like the thorny soil of Jesus' parable in Luke chapter 8, that our heart is choked by cares and riches and pleasures of this life? Instead of a deep faith and a deep trust in God, does our speech betray our discontent and our doubt? And on we could go with negative ways that our speech can betray us. Gossip, lies, murmuring and complaining, profanity. Just as telling, though, sometimes are the things that we don't say. When we fail to defend the church and the truth against attacks from naysayers and false doctrine. When we fail to share the gospel with the lost. When we fail to speak a word of kindness and reflect the love of Christ. Our lack of speech in these situations betrays us as well. And then another way that our speech can betray us is when it's hypocritical. When we proclaim to the world that we are a Christian, but our actions say otherwise. I saw a cartoon the other day that I thought was pretty on point. It was a businessman, and he was asking a friend if he should put one of those Greek fish symbols on the corner of his company's business card. If you're not familiar with this symbol, historians tell us supposedly that the first century Christians sometimes used this as a secret symbol of their meeting places. I don't know if that's true or not, but the friend was asking, or the businessman was asking his friend if he should put one of those on his business card. And the friend said, why? And he said, well, so people will know that we're a Christian company. And very thoughtfully, the friend responded, why don't you leave it off and see if they can tell by your work ethic and your honesty instead? Now, don't get me wrong. I don't necessarily have a problem with symbols. But what I'm asking is, do we back them up with our actions? You can say you're a Christian with a fish sticker or an "In God We Trust" tag on your car, but your rude or your illegal driving habits will betray you. You can say you're a Christian with a cross around your neck, but your failure to take up your cross despite the costs, will betray you. You can say you're a Christian and that you want your children to have Christian friends and one day have a Christian marriage, but your failure to encourage and help them reach that goal will betray you. For example, our children recently had the opportunity to meet and spend time with young people from Christian homes all over the country, just 10 miles up the road. In short, as the old saying goes, actions speak louder than words. And so what's your shibboleth? What's mine? I think we can all admit that we have areas of our life where our speech and our actions betray us. Certainly there's room for improvement. And as I said, the judges of the Old Testament, they weren't perfect either. But even with their imperfections, God was able to use them to further his will. Judges 12 and verse 7 tells us the end of Jephthah's story, at least this side of eternity. It says, Jephthah judged Israel for 6 years. Then Jephthah the Gileadite died and was buried in one of the cities of Gilead. I find that comforting to know that he was buried back home. Jephthah certainly had a rocky start. He was the son of a prostitute. He was banished by his family. He was leader of a gang of worthless men, whatever that means. But by his faith and his obedience, he certainly became a hero of faith.